The mud in Coal Hollow didn't just coat your boots, it swallowed you whole. It was a thick, black slurry of coal dust, half-melted snow, and horse manure that sucked at the hem of Martha Mattie June's dress like a greedy mouth. It was the first Saturday of the spring barter, a day that was supposed to mean hope, the end of the long, starving winter, the trading of furs for flour, of labor for seed. But for Mattie, standing on the back of her stepfather's buckboard wagon in the center of the thoroughfare, it felt like an execution. The air smelled of wet wool, wood smoke, and the sharp metallic tang of desperation. The sun was a pale, watery eye behind a veil of gray clouds, offering no warmth, only a harsh, flat light that exposed every stain on the town's conscience. "Look at the size of her!" A voice crowed from the crowd gathered around the wagon. It was stamped with a wheezing laugh of Old Man Miller, the tanner. "Careful, Jebediah, that axle's bowing in the middle. She's gonna snap the wood." A ripple of laughter tore through the assembly. It was a jagged, ugly sound, sharper than the wind coming off the peaks. Mattie kept her eyes fixed on the toes of her boots, which were split at the seams. She felt the heat rising in her face, a burning flush that started at her neck and consumed her whole head. She wished the earth would open up and drag her down into the mines. She wished she could shrink, fold herself into a pocket, disappear like smoke. But Mattie couldn't disappear. She was substantial. She was, as the town whispered behind their hands, a mountain of a woman. Her hips were wide as a door frame, her arms thick and soft, her bosom ample enough to strain the buttons of the gray calico dress she had sewn herself. In a town where hunger hollowed out cheeks and turned ribs into ladders, Mattie's size was seen as a sin, a hoarding of resources, a visual insult to their starvation. "She's a worker," her stepfather Jebediah shouted, pacing the length of the wagon bed like a carnival barker. He waved a hand toward her, his fingernails black with soot. "Strong back, can sew a quilt in 2 days, can cook a stew out of shoe leather and make it taste like venison." "She'd eat the stew before it hit the bowl," a miner shouted from the back, leaning on a pickaxe. The crowd erupted. Men slapped their knees. Women thin, haggard women with faces like dried apples snickered behind their shawls, their eyes darting over Mattie's form with a mixture of pity and revulsion. "I'm asking for a fair trade," Jebediah yelled, sweat beading on his upper lip despite the chill. "She eats me out of house and home. I can't feed a mouth that size no more. Who'll take her? A sack of seed corn, a brace of chickens?" Mattie squeezed her hands together under her apron until her knuckles turned white. "Please," she prayed silently to a God she wasn't sure was listening. "Please let it be over. Let someone take me. Anyone." She felt the vibration of the wagon as Jebediah stomped. "Come on now. She's sturdy. Keeps you warm in the winter. Better than a wood stove." "Too fat for a husband," a young man jeered, tossing a clod of mud that struck the side of the wagon with a wet thwack. "I'd need a team of oxen just to roll her over." Mattie flinched. The shame was a physical weight, heavier than her body, crushing the air from her lungs. She felt the tears pricking her eyes, hot and stinging, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give them that satisfaction. She locked her knees, terrified that if she moved, the wagon really would creak, and the laughter would never end. Then the birds stopped singing. It happened in an instant. The chatter of the crowd, the haggling over grain prices, the shrieking laughter had all died away, replaced by a sudden suffocating silence. The horses at the hitching rail pinned their ears back and stamped nervously. A dog whined and slunk under a porch. From the northern end of the street, where the road dissolved into the dark, towering pines of the timberline, a shadow emerged. He rode a horse that looked like it had been bred for war. It was a massive black Percheron, its coat shaggy and unkempt, its hooves the size of dinner plates striking the mud with a rhythmic ground-shaking thud. Clop, squelch, clop, squelch. The rider was terrifying. He was a giant of a man, draped in furs that still smelled of the animal. Wolf, bear, elk. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of a battered wide-brimmed hat and a beard as black and tangled as a briar patch. A scar, white and jagged like lightning, ran from his temple down into the beard, pulling one eye slightly closed. Silas Vance, the wolf. The townspeople shrank back, pressing themselves against the storefronts. They knew the stories. They said he lived in a cave. They said he ate raw meat. They said he had killed a man in Abilene just for looking at him wrong. He came down from the high peaks only twice a year, and he never spoke more than 2 words at a time. He rode through the center of the crowd, his gaze fixed straight ahead. The miners lowered their eyes. Even the dogs went silent. He pulled the massive horse to a halt in front of Jebediah's wagon. The beast blew air from its nostrils, twin plumes of steam rising in the cold air. Silas sat there, a monolith of leather and fur. He looked at Jebediah, who was suddenly trembling, his bluster gone. Then slowly, Silas turned his head. He looked at Maddie. Maddie held her breath. She waited for the sneer. She waited for the disgust she saw in every other man's eyes. Silas's eyes were gray, not the gray of the sky, but the gray of steel, cold, hard, sharp. They swept over her, taking in the mud on her hem, the tightness of her dress, the way her hands clutched her apron. He didn't look away. He didn't laugh. He studied her with a terrifying intensity, like a wolf assessing a deer in deep snow. What can I do for you, Mr. Vance?" Jebediah stammered, wringing his hands. Just trying to offload some burden. The girl, she's—" Silas shifted in his saddle. The leather creaked loudly in the silence. "Cooks?" Silas rumbled. His voice was deep, a subterranean sound that seemed to vibrate in Maddie's chest. "Like a dream," Jebediah squeaked. "Best biscuits in the county. Just expensive to keep. You know how it is." Silas ignored him. He kept his eyes on Maddie. "So's?" Yes, she made that dress she's wearing." Silas looked at the dress. He looked at the strained seams. He looked at the shivering woman inside it. He reached into his coat pocket. The crowd held its breath. Was he reaching for a gun? A knife? He pulled out a single object and tossed it. It arced through the air and landed at Jebediah's feet on the wagon bed with a heavy, dull thud. It wasn't a coin. It was a nugget. Raw gold, jagged and unpolished, the size of a robin's egg. Jebediah stared at it. His eyes bulged. That single rock was worth more than the wagon, the mules, and the shack they lived in combined. "Silas," said. Jebediah scrambled to grab the gold, biting it to test its softness. "Sold. She's yours. Take her. No returns." The crowd gasped. A murmur started. Shock, jealousy, confusion. Why would the wolf want the whale? "He'll eat her," someone whispered. "He needs the tallow for his lamps." "She'll never get on that horse," Old Man Miller cackled, breaking the tension. "Hey, Vance, you got a winch in your saddlebags. You're gonna need a block and tackle to hoist that beef." Laughter bubbled up again, nervous but cruel. "She'll break the horse's back." "Make her walk. Let's see her waddle." Maddie felt the tears finally spill over. This was the final humiliation. She looked at the massive horse, towering high above the wagon bed. She couldn't mount it. She wasn't agile. She was heavy. She would try, and she would fail, and she would fall in the mud, and they would laugh until they choked. I can walk behind," Maddie whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, I'll walk." Silas didn't answer. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. He landed with a heavy impact that splashed mud onto the onlookers. He stood a head taller than any man there. He walked to the back of the wagon. The crowd fell silent again, watching. Silas stopped in front of Maddie. Up close, he smelled of pine resin, cold wind, and something metallic like blood on iron. He looked up at her standing on the wagon bed. "Come," he said. Maddie shook her head, terrified. I'll break him. I'm too heavy. Please, sir." Silas reached out. His hands were enormous, scarred and calloused, the knuckles rough as tree bark. He didn't ask. He didn't negotiate. He grabbed her by the waist. Maddie gasped. His hands spanned her sides, gripping her firmly through the layers of petticoats and flesh. She braced herself for his grunt of exertion. For the moment, he would realize his mistake and let go. But he didn't grunt. Silas bent his knees slightly, and then, with a surge of raw, terrifying power, he lifted her. He pulled her off the wagon bed, as if she were a sack of feathers. He swung her through the air, her skirt swirling, her feet dangling helplessly. The crowd watched in stunned disbelief. This was a woman they called a behemoth, a woman 2 men would struggle to carry on a stretcher, and Silas Vance held her against his chest with one arm under her knees and the other around her back, his breathing unchanged. He turned and walked to the horse. Maddie clutched at the lapels of his fur coat, her face buried in the rough hair to hide her shame. She felt the hardness of him, a wall of muscle beneath the skins. He was warm, impossibly warm. He didn't struggle. He lifted her high and deposited her onto the saddle blanket sideways. "Hold the pommel," he commanded. He swung himself up behind her. The horse shifted its weight, snorting, but it didn't buckle. It accepted the burden just as its master had. Silas wrapped his arms around her to grab the reins. For a moment, she was completely encased in him, his chest against her back, his arms caging her in, the bare fur shielding her from the wind and the eyes of the town. He carried her," someone whispered in awe. Silas kicked the horse into motion. They didn't look back. They rode straight through the mud, past the gaping stepfather clutching his gold, past the silent mockers, and toward the tree line. Maddie sat rigid, terrified and confused, as the town of Coal Hollow faded behind them. She was leaving the only hell she had ever known, but she was riding straight into the devil's territory, held fast against the chest of a man who had lifted her weight as if it were nothing at all. The ascent into the high country was a slow, brutal climb that seemed to strip away the world layer by layer. The mud of Coal Hollow gave way to frozen slush, then to hard-packed snow that crunched loudly under the massive hooves of the Percheron. The air grew thin and sharp, tasting of ozone and ice, burning Maddie's lungs with every ragged breath she took. She sat rigid within the circle of Silas Vance's arms, terrified to move, terrified to lean back, terrified that the slightest shift in her weight would cause the horse to stumble on the narrow, treacherous switchbacks. She was keenly aware of the man behind her. He was a furnace. The heat radiating from his chest through the layers of bear fur and wool was a physical force, pressing against her back, mocking the freezing wind that whipped at her exposed face. He didn't speak. Not once. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the ancient pines, the creak of the saddle leather straining under their combined weight, and the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the horse. Maddie's mind raced with the dark whispers of the town. He eats raw meat. He keeps women in cages. He's a beast. She squeezed her eyes shut, clutching the pommel until her fingers were numb. Why had he bought her? Was she to be a servant? A drudge to haul water until her heart gave out? Or was it worse? Was she simply a curiosity, a freak, to be stared at in the solitude of his mountain? As they climbed higher, the trees began to thin, twisted into gnarled shapes by the relentless wind. The clouds that had hung gray over the town descended upon them, thick and suffocating. Snow began to fall, not the gentle flakes of a Christmas card, but hard, driving pellets that stung like buckshot. "Storm," Silas grunted. It was the first word he had spoken in 3 hours. The vibration of his voice against her spine made her jump. He kicked the horse into a faster gait, a lumbering trot that jarred Maddie's teeth. The path leveled out onto a granite shelf that jutted from the mountainside like a broken tooth. There, crouched against the sheer rock face, was the cabin. It wasn't a house, it was a fortress. Built of logs the diameter of whiskey barrels, darkened by age and smoke, it looked as if it had grown out of the stone itself. There were no windows on the windward side, only a low, heavy door reinforced with iron straps. Smoke whipped from the stone chimney, flattened instantly by the gale. Silas pulled the horse to a halt. The snow here was deep drifts piled waist-high against the woodpile. The wind roared, a deafening sound that drowned out Maddie's whimper of fear. Silas swung his leg over the saddle and dropped into the snow. He sank to his knees. He didn't seem to notice. He reached up, his movements efficient and unhurried. "Down," he said. Maddie looked at the drop. It was a long way down. She looked at the snow. If she jumped, she would sink. She would be stuck. The humiliation of it, floundering like a beached whale while he watched, paralyzed her. I can't," she whispered, the wind tearing the words away. Silas didn't wait for her to explain. He stepped closer to the horse, trudging through the drift. He reached up. For the second time that day, the giant laid his hands on her. He gripped her waist. Maddie braced herself. She was heavy. Everyone said so. Her stepfather groaned when she sat on the buckboard. The pew creaked in church. But Silas Vance didn't groan. He planted his feet wide in the snow. He pulled her from the saddle, sliding her down the side of the horse until her feet touched the surface of the drift. But he didn't let go. The snow was too deep. Maddie would have been buried to her hips. Silas shifted his grip. In one fluid motion, he swept his arm behind her knees and scooped her up against his chest. He lifted her high, cradling her against the rough, wet fur of his coat. He carried her. He walked toward the cabin, his boots punching deep holes in the snow, his breath pluming in the gray light. He didn't stumble. He didn't struggle for balance. He held her close, shielding her face from the biting wind with his shoulder. They reached the door. It was frozen shut, rimmed with ice. Silas didn't put her down to open it. He balanced her weight easily, shifted his stance, and kicked the heavy oak door. Thud. Ice shattered. He kicked it again. Crack. The door swung inward. He stepped over the threshold, carrying his bride out of the storm and into the gloom. He kicked the door shut behind them with his heel, dropping the heavy wooden bar into place with a definitive clunk. The roar of the wind was instantly muffled, replaced by the crackle of a dying fire in the massive stone hearth. Silas lowered her. He set her on her feet gently, making sure she was steady before he let go. Maddie stood there, trembling, her hands still clutching her apron. The cabin was freezing, only slightly warmer than the outside. It smelled of wood smoke, cured leather, and something muskier, the scent of a solitary animal's den. It was a single large room. A bed in the corner was piled high with buffalo robes. A table sat in the center, cluttered with skinning knives, ammunition, and dirty tin plates. Traps hung from the rafters, their steel jaws glinting in the firelight. Silas ignored her. He walked to the hearth, stirred the embers, and threw a log on the fire. Sparks flew up the chimney. He turned and looked at her. In the firelight, his scar looked deeper, red and angry. He stripped off his heavy bear coat and hung it on a peg, revealing a flannel shirt that strained across his broad shoulders and suspenders that held up buckskin trousers stained with old blood. "Warm yourself," he grunted. He didn't offer a chair. He didn't ask her name. He walked past her to a corner where a ladder led to a dark loft. He grabbed a sack of grain and headed back to the door. "Horse," he said, "needs feed." He unbarred the door and vanished back into the storm, leaving her alone. Maddie stood in the center of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She hugged herself, rubbing her arms through the thin calico. She was here. She was really here, the property of the wolf. She looked around. The cabin was a disaster. Not filthy exactly, but neglected. A layer of dust coated the shelves. The floor was unswept, littered with pine needles and dried mud. A pot on the stove was crusted with something black and unidentifiable. It was a place where a man merely existed, waiting to die or kill. She looked at the bed. It was the only soft thing in the room. He bought me for a keg of gold, she thought, a cold stone settling in her stomach. He expects. But when the door opened again 10 minutes later, Silas didn't look at the bed. He stomped the snow from his boots, carrying an armload of firewood. He dumped it by the hearth. He walked to the larder, a wooden cupboard with a wire mesh front, and pulled out a strip of dried venison jerky so hard it looked like wood bark. He tossed it onto the table. "Eat," he said. He grabbed a rag and a bottle of gun oil, sat on a stool with his back to her, and began to disassemble his rifle. "Mr. Vance?" Maddie whispered. He didn't turn Silas. "Silas, where should I sleep?" He gestured with the barrel of the rifle toward the bed in the corner. "There." "And you?" He pointed a thumb toward the ladder. "Loft." Maddie blinked. He wasn't going to touch her? "But you paid," she stammered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "You paid gold," my stepfather said. Silas stopped cleaning the gun. He turned on the stool. The metal scraped against the wood floor, a harsh sound. He looked at her. His eyes were unreadable, but his jaw was set tight. "Stepfather is a fool," Silas growled. "You take up space. Bed is big, loft is small. You take the bed." He turned back to his work. The rhythmic swish-swish of the oil rag was the only sound in the room. Maddie stared at his broad back. He didn't want her. The realization was a confusing mix of relief and a sharp, familiar sting of rejection. Too fat even for the savage, she thought bitterly. He probably bought me to mend his socks because his fingers are too big. She looked at the jerky. She tried to bite it. It was impossible. Her stomach rumbled, a loud, treacherous growl that echoed in the silence. Silas didn't react. Maddie looked around the kitchen area. She saw a sack of beans. She saw a ham hock hanging from a hook, coated in dust but cured. She saw a bin of potatoes that were starting to sprout eyes. She looked at her hands. They were large. They were soft. The town mocked them, but they were capable. "I am not a guest here," she decided, a spark of defiance lighting in her chest. "And I am not a pet. I am a worker. He paid for a worker." She moved. She found a bucket and filled it with snow from just outside the door, melting it on the stove. She found a bar of lye soap. She rolled up her sleeves, exposing her thick, pale forearms. She scrubbed the pot. She put her weight into it, the weight everyone despised, using her shoulder to scour away the burnt crust. She chopped the ham hock, the knife looking small in her hand. She rinsed the beans. She peeled the potatoes. The cabin began to change. The sharp metallic smell of gun oil and wet dog was slowly, subtly replaced by something else. The rich, salty scent of ham. The earthiness of beans. The steam rising from the pot added a moisture to the dry air that made it easier to breathe. She found a broom made of twigs and swept the floor. She wiped down the table, clearing a space among the ammunition. 2 hours later, Silas stood up. He racked the rifle on the wall. He stretched, his spine cracking audibly. He turned around, expecting to see the woman cowering in the corner or asleep. He stopped. He sniffed the air, his nostrils flared. He looked at the table. It was clean. 2 tin plates were set out, wiped free of grease. In the center of the table was the pot, bubbling gently. He looked at Maddie. She was standing by the stove, twisting her apron in her hands. Her face was flushed from the heat of the cooking, strands of hair escaping her bun to frame her round face. She looked terrified, waiting for him to yell at her for touching his supplies. I found the ham," she whispered, looking down, "and the beans. I hope it's all right. I can work it off if—" Silas walked to the pot. He moved slowly, like a wolf approaching a trap. He looked inside. Thick, hot soup. He hadn't had a hot meal that he didn't cook himself over a campfire in 5 years. He lived on hardtack and burnt meat. He looked at her. He looked at her flour-dusted hands. He looked at the way she filled the space in the kitchen, not with clutter, but with presence. He sat down. The chair groaned under him. "Bowl," he said. Maddie scrambled to ladle the stew into a bowl. She placed it in front of him. Silas didn't wait for it to cool. He ate. He ate with a ferocious, silent intensity. He wiped the bowl clean with a piece of stale bread she had found and toasted. He ate 3 bowls. When he was done, he sat back, letting out a long breath. The tension in his shoulders, which seemed permanent, dropped an inch. He looked at Maddie. She hadn't eaten yet. She was watching him, her eyes wide and anxious. "You cook," he stated. "Yes," Maddie said softly. "It's all I'm good at. My stepfather said I eat more than I'm worth, so I had to learn to make it stretch." Silas frowned. The scar on his face pulled tight. He stood up, towering over her. Maddie shrank back against the warm stones of the hearth. Silas reached out. Maddie flinched, squeezing her eyes shut. He took the ladle from her hand. He filled the second bowl to the brim, heavy with ham and potatoes. He shoved it into her hand. "Eat," he commanded. "You are not a bird. Do not eat like one." He grabbed a heavy buffalo robe from the bed and tossed it onto the chair opposite him. "Sit." Maddie sat. She took a bite of the stew. It was hot. It was salty. It tasted like survival. Silas watched her eat. He didn't smile. He didn't say thank you, but he didn't leave to go to the loft. He sat there, in the firelight, watching the woman he had bought eat the food she had made, and for the first time in a decade, the silence in the cabin didn't feel empty. It felt full. Outside, the blizzard slammed against the walls, burying the world in white. But inside, the fire roared, fed by the wood he had chopped and the care she had given, holding the cold at bay. The blizzard didn't break with the dawn. It raged for 3 days, a white screaming wall that buried the cabin in drifts so deep the windows became opaque blocks of ice. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the howling wind, the groaning timber of the roof, and the shrinking circle of warmth around the hearth. Silas didn't stop. He was a machine built of gristle and stubbornness. He went out into the whiteout twice a day to dig a tunnel to the lean-to, ensuring the massive percheron had hay and water. He chopped wood until his hands bled, terrified the fire would die. He checked the roof for structural integrity, battling wind gusts that threatened to peel him off the shingles. Maddie watched him with growing dread. She saw the gray pallor of his skin beneath the beard. She heard the rattle in his chest, a wet, bubbling sound that grew louder with every breath. He ate her stew, but he barely tasted it. His eyes were glassy, focused on a horizon only he could see. On the fourth evening, the wind died. The silence that followed was heavy and unnerving. Silas stood by the door, reaching for his coat. "Traps," he rasped. "Need to check the lines, snow buried them." "Silas." "No," Maddie said, stepping in front of him. She wiped her hands on her apron, her heart hammering. "You're burning up. I can feel the heat coming off you from here. The traps can wait." "Winter doesn't wait," Silas growled. He tried to push past her, but his legs didn't cooperate. He took one step and crumpled. It wasn't a graceful fall. It was the collapse of a mountain. He hit the floorboards with a bone-jarring thud that shook the jars on the shelves. "Silas!" Maddie screamed. She dropped to her knees beside him. He was shivering violently, his teeth chacking together with a sound like dry stones rattling in a tin can. His skin was scorching hot to the touch, dry and papery, yet he was convulsing, as if he were naked in a snowbank. "Cold," he moaned, curling into a fetal ball, looking suddenly small despite his massive frame. "Ice in the blood." Lung fever. Maddie knew it. She had seen it take half a dozen miners in Coal Hollow during the wet season. It killed the strong faster than the weak. It turned their own strength against them, burning them out from the inside. "I have to get you to the bed," Maddie whispered, panic fluttering in her chest like a trapped bird. She grabbed him under the arms. He was dead weight, 250 pounds of dense muscle and bone. A normal woman couldn't have moved him, but Maddie wasn't a normal woman. She was the mountain. She dug her heels into the cracks of the floorboards. She used her thick, sturdy legs. She heaved. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged him across the room. She wrestled him onto the mattress, gasping for air, sweat stinging her eyes. She stripped him. It wasn't an act of romance. It was a desperate medical necessity. His clothes were damp with sweat and melted snow. She pulled off his heavy boots, his thick wool socks, his buckskin trousers. She left him in his long johns, which were soaked through. She piled the furs on him, the buffalo robe, the elk skins, the heavy wool blankets she had brought from town. It wasn't enough. An hour passed. The fire was roaring hot enough to blister the paint on the mantel, but Silas was still shaking. His lips were turning blue. The riggers were tearing him apart. He started to rave. "Sarah!" he shouted, thrashing against the weight of the furs. "The roof! It's too heavy! Get out!" Maddie froze. "Sarah! The ghost in the cabin!" "I can't hold it," Silas wept, tears leaking from his squeeze-shut eyes. "You're too small. You'll break. Sarah, eat! Please, eat!" Maddie stood over him, her hands trembling. He was reliving a nightmare. He was watching someone freeze, someone starve. He was dying. The cold was in his marrow. External heat wasn't working. Maddie looked down at her own body. The body her stepfather had cursed. The body the town had mocked. The layers of softness, the heavy breasts, the thick thighs, the stomach that rolled when she sat, the insulation they had laughed about. Heat, she thought, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. "I am heat." She looked at the dying man. She looked at the door, barred against the night. There was no doctor. There was no medicine. There was only her. Maddie made a decision. She didn't hesitate. She didn't let shame stop her. She unbuttoned her dress. It fell to the floor in a gray pool. She unlaced her corset, the cage she hated, and threw it into the corner. She peeled off her petticoats until she stood in the firelight in her thin cotton chemise. She was vast. She was pale. She was soft. She climbed into the bed. She pulled back the mountain of furs, The cold air from his shaking body hit her skin like a slap. She lay down beside him. She pressed her body against his. She pulled his freezing back against her chest. She wrapped her thick, soft arms around his broad shoulders. She tangled her legs with his, pulling his icy feet between her warm calves. She pressed her soft, heavy stomach against his rigid spine. "Shh," she whispered into his hair, which smelled of fever and smoke. "I've got you, Silas. I'm here." He flinched at the contact. He groaned, trying to pull away, fighting invisible demons. "No! Fire! Too hot!" "Not fire," Maddie soothed, holding him tighter, using her weight to pin him down. "Just Maddie. Just warmth." She molded herself to him. She let her body heat, the immense radiating warmth of her size seep into him. She became a human blanket, a furnace of flesh and blood. Sometime in the deepest, darkest part of the night, the thrashing stopped. Silas let out a long, shuddering breath. He turned in her arms. Instinctively, blindly, he sought the source of the heat. He rolled over. He buried his face in the crook of her neck. His arm, heavy as lead, draped over her waist. He clung to her. He dug his fingers into the soft flesh of her back, not to hurt, but to hold on. "Soft," he murmured, his voice thick with delirium. "Not bones, no sharp edges." "I'm here," Maddie whispered, stroking his damp hair. "I'm sturdy, Silas. I won't break." "Sarah broke," he confessed, the words a broken sob against her throat. "Winter of '82. She was delicate, like a bird. I held her, and I felt her freeze. I felt her ribs snap under the weight of the snow. I couldn't warm her. She was just bones." He nuzzled closer, pressing his face into the softness of her shoulder. "You are abundance. You are life." He didn't let go. He slept. The fever broke with the dawn. Maddie woke to the sound of dripping water. The icicles outside were melting. The storm had passed. She lay still, afraid to move. She was tangled with him. Her leg was thrown over his hip. Her arm was pillowed under his head. Her chemise had ridden up, leaving her skin bare against his. She looked down. Silas was awake. He was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling beams. His eyes were clear. The glassy look of death was gone, replaced by a profound, stunned exhaustion. He turned his head slowly. He looked at her. Maddie's face burned. She scrambled backward, trying to pull her chemise down, trying to cover the abundance he had clung to. I'm sorry," she stammered, tears springing to her eyes. "You were freezing. The riggers. I didn't know how else to get you warm. I know it's disgusting. I'll get up." She tried to rise, to flee to the loft and hide her shame. "Wait." The word was a rasp, weak but commanding. Silas reached out. His hand, shaking slightly, caught her wrist. He didn't pull. He just held her. He looked at her arm, the soft, pale underside of her forearm where the blue veins traced a map under the skin. "Disgusting?" he repeated. The word sounded alien in his mouth. He pushed himself up on one elbow, wincing as his chest protested. He looked down at her. He looked at the curve of her hip under the thin cotton. He looked at the fullness of her breast pressed against the mattress. "You saved me," he said roughly. "The fire went out. You stayed lit." He moved his hand. He slid it from her wrist to her waist. Then, terrifyingly, he moved it to her stomach. Maddie flinched. She tried to suck it in, to hide the roll of flesh. "Don't," she whispered. "Please, Silas, don't look at it." Silas didn't look away. He spread his large, scarred fingers wide, encompassing the softness. He pressed his hand gently into her, feeling the give, the warmth, the substance. "Why hide the harvest?" he asked softly. He leaned down. Maddie stopped breathing. Silas pressed his forehead against her stomach. He closed his eyes. He let out a long sigh, a sound of absolute shattering relief. "I have been cold for 5 years," he whispered against her skin. "I thought the cold was all there was left, just rock and ice and bones." He kissed her stomach. Through the fabric, he pressed his lips to the very part of her the town had mocked. It wasn't a sexual kiss. It was a benediction, a worship. "Warm," he murmured, "my anchor." Maddie lay frozen, the tears falling freely now. For 20 years she had been told she was too much, too heavy, a burden to be dragged. And here was the wolf of the mountain, the terrifying savage, clinging to her waist as if she were the only thing keeping him from falling off the edge of the earth. She slowly reached out. She tangled her fingers in his thick black beard. She pulled his head closer. "I'm not going anywhere, Silas," she whispered, her voice fierce. "I am heavy. I stay put." Silas looked up at her. His gray eyes were wet. "Stay put," he agreed. He pulled her down then. He didn't send her away. He wrapped his massive arms around her, pulling her back into the shelter of his body, burying his face in her neck. He held her tight, not because she was a worker, not because she was a transaction, but because she was the fire in his winter. They lay there as the sun rose higher, two outcasts in a fortress of stone, bound together by the terrifying intimacy of survival. The friction was gone. In its place was a silent, unshakable vow, us against the cold, us against the world. The morning sun that broke over the eastern ridge didn't bring warmth. It brought a blinding, accusatory light that reflected off the melting snow. The world was dripping. The silence of the deep winter was replaced by the cacophony of the thaw water rushing in hidden veins under the ice, a cracked boom of snow loads sliding off the pine boughs, and the rhythmic, wet thud of mud shifting on the slopes. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of sickness breaking. Silas sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He was alive. The fever had burned itself out in the night, but it had taken his strength with it. He looked like a hollowed-out tree, his skin gray and clammy, his massive frame trembling with the effort of simply sitting upright. Maddie stood by the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal. She moved quietly, terrified of shattering the fragile peace that had settled between them in the dark hours. Every time she looked at him, she remembered the weight of his head on her stomach, the way he had kissed her skin. The memory made her flush hot, a feeling entirely separate from the heat of the cast-iron stove. "You need to eat," she said softly, bringing a bowl to him. Silas looked up. His eyes were clear but weary. He took the bowl, his large hands shaking slightly. "Traps," he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "Line hasn't been checked in 4 days. Wolves will get the catch." "The wolves can have them," Maddie said firmly. "You aren't going out there. You can barely stand." "I am not an invalid," Silas growled, trying to rise. His knees buckled immediately. Maddie caught him, her arm hooking around his waist to steady him. He leaned into her, heavy and hot, and for a moment, they just stood there, the contact electric. "Sit," Maddie commanded, guiding him back down. "I'll check the woodpile. You eat." She turned to the door, wiping her hands on her apron. She unbarred it and pushed it open. The bright light blinded her for a second. She blinked, stepping out onto the flat granite slab that served as a porch. The air smelled of wet pine and something else. Something sour. Something like stale tobacco and unwashed bodies. Maddie froze. The sound of hooves sucking in mud drifted up from the switchback trail. It wasn't the rhythmic plod of a pack mule. It was the chaotic, scrambling noise of horses being driven hard up a slope they weren't meant to climb. "Silas," Maddie whispered, stepping back toward the door. But it was too late. They crested the ridge, 4 of them. Leading the pack was a man riding a mule that looked ready to collapse. He wore a bowler hat stained with sweat and a coat that had seen better decades. "Jebediah." Maddie's blood turned to ice, her stepfather. Behind him rode the town sheriff, a man named Holloway with a tin star pinned to a duster that looked like a shroud. Flanking them were 2 hired guns from the valley men with low-slung holsters and eyes that looked like dead fish. They pulled up in the yard, the horses blowing hard, steam rising from their flanks. "Well, well," Jebediah crowed, his voice cracking on the high notes. "Look at the lady of the manor. Living high on the hog, ain't you, Maddie?" Maddie gripped the doorframe. "What do you want, Jebediah? You sold me. We have no business." "Business?" Jebediah laughed, swinging his leg over the mule and sliding into the slush. "Oh, we got business, girl. See, I got to thinking. That nugget, that little rock Silas threw at me, it bought a lot of whiskey. But whiskey runs out. And then I got to thinking, if a man throws a rock like that away for a heavy sow like you, imagine what he's got buried under the floorboards." He took a step forward, his boots squelching in the mud. "I'm here for the rest of the payment, Maddie, and since the sheriff here says selling a woman ain't strictly legal, well, we're here to rescue you too." "I don't need rescuing," Maddie shouted, her voice shaking but loud. "Get off this land." "You watch your tone," Jebediah snarled, his face twisting into the ugly sneer she knew so well. "You're still my property till I say otherwise. Now move aside, fat girl, before I move you myself." A shadow fell over Maddie. Silas didn't walk out, he emerged. He held the doorframe with one hand to keep himself upright, his knuckles white. He was shirtless, wearing only his breeches and suspenders, his chest heaving with the effort of moving. He looked like a revenant, pale, scarred, and terrifying. "Leave," Silas said. The word was a low vibration, felt more than heard. Sheriff Holloway chuckled, resting his hand on the butt of his revolver. "You don't look so good, Vance. Lung fever? I seen men die of that. Looks like you're halfway in the box already." "I said leave," Silas repeated. He stepped onto the porch, putting himself between Maddie and the men. He swayed slightly. "We ain't leaving without the gold, Vance," Holloway said, his voice hardening, "and we're taking the girl as a witness. Can't have you crying to the marshal." "She stays," Silas growled. "She's too heavy for you to stop us, cripple." One of the hired guns laughed. "Look at him. He can barely hold his own weight up, let alone hers." Jebediah grinned, emboldened by Silas's weakness. "Get him, boys. Don't shoot him yet. He needs to tell us where the cash is." The 2 hired guns dismounted. They pulled clubs, heavy hickory handles weighted with lead from their saddles. "Maddie," screamed. Silas moved. Despite the fever, despite the weakness, the wolf took over. He launched himself off the porch. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't need one. He hit the first gunman with the force of a falling boulder. They went down in the mud. Silas slammed his fist into the man's face. Crunch. The sound of a nose breaking was sickeningly loud. But the second gunman was there. He swung the lead-weighted club. Whack! It connected with Silas's ribs. Silas grunted, the air leaving his lungs in a rush. He collapsed to one knee, coughing, clutching his side. "Get him!" Jebediah shrieked, dancing a jig of excitement in the snow. "Break his legs!" The sheriff stepped forward and kicked Silas in the chest. Silas sprawled onto his back, gasping, his face gray with pain. The fever had robbed him of his endurance. He tried to rise, snarling, but the sheriff put a boot on his throat, pressing down. "Where's the gold, Vance?" Holloway demanded, cocking his revolver and aiming it at Silas's head. "Tell me, or I paint the snow with your brains." Maddie stood on the porch. She watched the man who had carried her through the storm, the man who had kissed her stomach and called it abundance, being crushed into the mud. She looked at Jebediah. He was laughing. He was looking at her with that familiar look of disgust and ownership. "Don't worry, Maddie," Jebediah sneered. "Once we get the gold, we'll sell you to the renderers. Maybe you're worth something as soap." Something inside Maddie snapped. It wasn't a loud snap. It was the quiet, terrifying sound of a tether breaking. She turned back into the cabin. She didn't run. She moved with a strange, heavy purpose. She went to the stove. The cast-iron skillet was sitting there. It was a massive thing, 14 inches across, seasoned black by years of grease and heat. It weighed 8 pounds. She picked it up. The handle was warm. The iron felt solid, heavy. "Too heavy," they said. "Too much." Maddie walked back out the door. Jebediah was busy cheering on the sheriff. "Press harder, Holloway. Make him squeal." Maddie stepped off the porch. She didn't make a sound. The mud muffled her footsteps. She walked up behind the gunman who was holding his club, waiting for his turn to hit Silas again. She didn't hesitate. She gripped the handle with both hands. She swung. She put her hips into it. She put the weight of the mountain into it. She put 20 years of mockery, of hunger, of shame into the swing. Clang! The sound was pure and ringing, like a church bell signaling the end of the world. The skillet connected with the back of the gunman's head. He didn't cry out. He simply folded. He dropped like a marionette with cut strings, face planting into the slush. The sound froze the yard. Sheriff Holloway spun around, taking his boot off Silas's throat. Jebediah stopped laughing, his mouth hanging open. They saw Maddie. She stood over the fallen man, heaving for breath. She held the skillet raised high, like a warrior queen holding a battle axe. Her eyes were wide, but they weren't filled with fear anymore. They were filled with a cold, terrifying rage. "Get away from my husband," she said. Her voice wasn't high. It wasn't a whisper. It was deep, resonant, and absolute. "You crazy sow!" Jebediah shrieked, fumbling for the knife at his belt. "You killed him!" "I'll kill you too," Maddie promised. She took a step forward. The mud didn't suck at her boots anymore. It anchored her. Holloway raised his gun, aiming at her. "Drop the pan, girl. I'll shoot." "Shoot me!" Maddie screamed, stepping between the sheriff and Silas. She presented her broad chest as a shield. "Shoot me! You think I'm scared of you? I've been scared my whole life. I'm done." Holloway hesitated. Shooting an unarmed woman, even a large one wielding a skillet, was a line even he was reluctant to cross in broad daylight. That hesitation cost him. Silas wasn't dead, and he wasn't done. Seeing Maddie stand over him, seeing her offer her body to the bullet to save him, triggered something ancient in his blood. He roared. He grabbed the sheriff's ankle with a hand that shook but still possessed the grip of a vice. He twisted. Holloway screamed as his knee popped. He fell backward, the gun firing harmlessly into the sky. Silas scrambled up. He was on all fours, then on his feet, swaying like a wounded bear. He grabbed the sheriff by the lapels of his duster and headbutted him. Crack! Holloway crumpled. Now it was just Jebediah. The stepfather looked at the two unconscious men. He looked at the giant, bleeding and snarling. He looked at the daughter he had sold, who was advancing on him with a cast-iron skillet raised for a killing blow. "Maddie, now Maddie," Jebediah whimpered, backing up toward his mule. "I'm your pa." "You're a salesman," Maddie spat, "and the sale is final." She swung the skillet again, not to hit him, but to strike the mule's flank. Whack! The mule screamed and kicked out. It caught Jebediah in the hip, sending him flying into the mud. He scrambled up, shrieking in pain and terror, and limped frantically down the trail, sliding and falling in the slush. "Run!" Maddie screamed after him, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Run, and tell them the mountain doesn't move." She stood there, chest heaving, the heavy iron pan trembling in her grip. The adrenaline was coursing through her, hot and electric. She turned to Silas. He was leaning against the porch post, clutching his ribs, blood dripping from his nose, but he wasn't looking at his wounds. He was looking at her. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of shock and a profound, worshipful awe. He looked at the skillet. He looked at the unconscious men. He looked at her fierce, flushed face. He took a stumbling step toward her. "Mattie," he wheezed. She dropped the skillet. It hit the mud with a dull thud. "I got them," she whispered, her hands starting to shake as the reality set in. I hit him." Silas reached her. He didn't hug her gently. He grabbed her. He wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his face in her neck, holding her so tight it hurt. He was shaking, his breath coming in ragged sobs against her skin. "You fought," he rasped. "You stood." "I told you," Maddie cried, clutching his bare shoulders, feeling the heat of him, the life of him. "I'm sturdy, Silas. I don't break." The sanctuary had been breached. The violence of the world had found them. But the woman who had been called too fat hadn't crumbled. She had become the hammer, and the wolf was safe in her shadow. The adrenaline crash hit Maddie like a physical blow. Her knees, which had been locked in defiance moments ago, suddenly turned to water. She swayed, grabbing onto Silas's arm to keep from sliding into the slush. Silas, despite his own injuries, instantly shifted his weight to support her. He winced as his bruised ribs protested, but his grip was iron. "Inside," he rasped, spitting a mouthful of blood into the snow. "We need inside." They left the unconscious men where they lay. The sheriff and the gunman would wake up with headaches that would last a lifetime, and without their weapons, Silas kicked the revolvers into the deep snowdrift off the edge of the ridge. They would have a long, humiliating walk back to Coal Hollow. Silas leaned heavily on Maddie as they crossed the threshold. He kicked the door shut behind them, dropping the heavy bar with a finality that echoed in the sudden silence of the cabin. He slumped onto the bench by the table, his breath hitching in shallow gasps. His nose was swelling rapidly, turning a violent shade of purple, and blood smeared his beard. Maddie didn't collapse. The sight of his pain gave her a new, sharper focus. She was the nurse now. She fetched a basin of snow, melting it quickly on the stove, and tore a strip from her petticoat. She stood between his spread knees, gently wiping the blood from his face. Silas hissed through his teeth as the cold cloth touched his nose, but he didn't pull away. He watched her. His eyes, usually so guarded, were wide and raw. "You," he started, his voice thick. "You stood in front of the gun." "He wasn't going to shoot," Maddie said, her voice trembling slightly as she rinsed the cloth. "He was a coward. Cowards only shoot when you run." "He could have," Silas argued, grabbing her wrist. His grip was desperate. "He could have put a hole in you, Maddie. In you." He pulled her hand to his chest, pressing it over his heart. "I bought you to keep the cold out, not to stop bullets, not to bleed." He stood up suddenly, ignoring the pain in his ribs. He paced the small room, agitating the air. He went to the corner where the loose floorboard was. He pried it up with a grunt. He pulled out a heavy canvas sack. He dumped it on the table. Gold, not just nuggets, but dust, coins, and raw ore. It was a fortune. Enough to build a mansion in San Francisco. Enough to buy a title in Europe. "Take it," Silas said, pushing the pile toward her. Maddie froze, the wet cloth dripping onto the floor. "Silas?" "Take it," he roared, the fear finally breaking through his anger. "Pack your bag. Tomorrow, when the sheriff wakes up, he'll come back with a posse, or the marshal. This place is cursed. I am cursed. Violence follows me like a shadow." He grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently. "You are too good for this, Maddie. You are soft. You are warm. You deserve a house with glass windows and a stove that doesn't smoke. You deserve to walk down a street without mud sucking at your boots." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "Go. Take the gold. Be safe. Find a man who doesn't live in a cave." Maddie stared at him. She looked at the gold, cold, hard metal that men killed for. She looked at the blood on his face. She looked at the fear in his eyes. Fear not for himself, but for her. She reached out and swept the gold off the table. It clattered to the floor, rolling into the dark corners of the cabin. Silas flinched. "You think I want safety?" Maddie asked, her voice rising. "I was safe in Coal Hollow, Silas. I was safe in the kitchen while they laughed at me. I was safe while I starved, because I was too ashamed to eat in public." She stepped closer to him, forcing him to look up at her. "I have never felt safe," she whispered fiercely. "I have only felt heavy, like a burden everyone wanted to put down." She took his face in her hands, ignoring the swelling. "You carried me," she said, "in the mud, in the snow. You picked me up when I was too heavy for the world. And today I carried you." "You shouldn't have to," Silas choked out. "That's what marriage is," Maddie cried. "It's carrying the weight when the other one can't. You think I'm soft? I just cracked a man's skull with a skillet, Silas. I am not soft. I am the mountain." Silas stared at her. He saw the fire in her eyes. He saw the woman who had transformed from a cowering victim into a warrior queen in the span of an hour. He realized, with a jolt that went deeper than his broken ribs, that he couldn't make her go. She had rooted herself here. "The mountain," he repeated, the ghost of a smile touching his bloody lips. "Yes," Patty said, "and mountains don't move for sheriffs, or stepfathers, or husbands who think they know best." She leaned in, pressing her forehead against his. "I am staying, Silas. I am keeping the gold. I am keeping the cabin. And I am keeping you. Try to move me and see what happens." Silas let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her neck. He held her tight, anchoring himself to her solidity. "I won't try," he promised. "I'm not that foolish." He kissed her, then not on the stomach, but on the mouth. It was a kiss of salt and blood and absolute, terrifying devotion. It was the seal on a contract that had nothing to do with gold and everything to do with survival. Epilogue 1 year later. The spring thaw had been kind to the high peaks. The valley below was a riot of wildflowers, blue columbine, and Indian paintbrush painting the slopes in vivid color. The cabin on the ledge had changed. It was no longer a grim, dark fortress. A new room had been added to the side, built of fresh, golden pine. A porch wrapped around the front, holding a rocking chair and a stack of firewood. The windows had glass now, shining in the sun. Silas Vance sat on the porch steps, whittling a piece of cedar. His scar had faded to a pale white line, and his beard was trimmed. He looked up as the door opened. Maddie stepped out. She was still large. She was still heavy. The blue calico dress she wore was cut wide to accommodate her hips, but she didn't hide them anymore. She wore a bright yellow ribbon in her hair, a splash of color against the gray rock. In her arms, she held a bundle. A baby, a girl with cheeks as round as apples and a tuft of black hair. Silas dropped the wood and the knife. He stood up, wincing slightly. The ribs still ached when it rained, and walked to them. "Is she sleeping?" he whispered, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "She's eating," Maddie smiled, shifting the blanket to show the baby nursing. "She has her father's appetite." Silas reached out a massive finger. The baby paused, her tiny hand gripping his callus. "Abundance," Silas murmured, looking from the child to his wife. The town of Coal Hollow still talked about them. They whispered about the wolf and the mountain. They said Silas Vance had found a vein of gold so deep it would never run dry. They said his wife was a witch who could freeze a man with a look. They were wrong. There was no magic on the ridge. There was only the simple, heavy truth of two people who had found the one place in the world where they fit. "The wind is picking up," Maddie said, looking at the sky. "Storm coming." Silas wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her and the child against his side. He kissed the top of her head. "Let it come," he said. "We have plenty of wood." He opened the door for her. He didn't carry her this time. She walked through on her own 2 feet, strong and steady. But as she crossed the threshold, he placed his hand on the small of her back, a constant, silent reminder, "I have you. I am here." The door closed against the wind, locking in the warmth, the smell of baking bread, and the sound of a family that had built a fortress out of love and cast iron.